Secondly, can it be lived? Do we live as though we are walking packs of neurons? We don't. We live as though we each have a unique first-person perspective on the world. We write and read autobiographies, by and large, is assuming their truthfulness of that person's experience. Mindfulness gurus tell us to focus on this inner self for a better state of well-being. Even the post-truth society that we find ourselves in defines truth by experience. So which is it? We have tied ourselves up in philosophical knots. Either there is a first-person experience by which you define this new post-truth, or you don't. Moreover, we treat others as though they are conscious beings as well. We experience outrage and anger at things like human trafficking, humanitarian crises, and climate change, precisely because we believe that the people involved are not simply packs of neurons, but conscious beings who experience suffering. It cannot be lived. We don't live this way. We might believe it in the lecture theatre. We don't live it on the streets. Thirdly, does it have explanatory power? Does it help make sense of the world? If something is true, it should help us make sense of the world rather than throw us into further confusion. Does the view that you are your brain make sense of human beings? Does it help explain what it means to be a person? It doesn't. It fails to explain this inner you that we all seem to have, and chalking it all down to cell voltages, neurotransmitters, and blood flow changes is simply not enough. Imagine I asked you to describe to me the smell of coffee. What would you say? You'd say you need to smell it. I can't break it down any further. And you couldn't offer me a diagram of the chemical structure of caffeine and how it interacts with water. That won't get me any closer to understanding the smell of coffee. And philosophers talk about qualia. And qualia are these qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. And we have these experiences all the time, things like seeing a color or tasting a food. And many scientists and philosophers believe that brain processes alone are not enough to explain qualia. Brain activity is not enough to explain human experience. And in fact, science from the clinic is suggesting that the connection between human consciousness and brain activity is much more complex than simply brain chemistry. There was a groundbreaking imaging study led by Professor Adrian Owen at the University of Cambridge, published in the journal Science in 2006, where they studied patients in a persistent vegetative state to see if there were signs of consciousness. And they were able to demonstrate that a small number of their patients showed conscious awareness despite having deeply damaged brains. The way that they did that was to get them to demonstrate that they were conscious using their minds. And they trained them to imagine playing tennis and imagine moving around their house. If you imagine you're playing tennis, your brain lights up all kinds of motor control and motor areas. And if you imagine moving around your house, all kinds of areas to do with spatial navigation light up. And they asked these patients a series of biographical questions that they could verify with family members. And they said, if you want to answer yes to this question, imagine you are playing tennis. If you want to answer no, imagine you are moving around your house. And they discovered that a small number of these patients were showing levels of consciousness. And Adrian Owen, who is not a theist, describes his research in this way. We have discovered that 15 to 20% of people in the vegetative state are fully conscious, although they never respond to any form of external stimulation. Many really are as oblivious and incapable of thought as their doctors believe, but a sizable number are experiencing something quite different. Intact minds adrift deep within damaged bodies and brains. For example, Michael Egnor, professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook, makes the point that many of his patients are missing large parts of their brains, but have quite good minds. And after 30 years of working in this field, Egnor has concluded that the mind of a person is simply beyond the workings of their brain. And he concludes that materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is. And yet, evidence from the laboratory, the operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion. Human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms. Now, to finish, we could say that much discussion is taken up with what consciousness is. But a way to break the philosophical stalemate is to return to where we started and ask, why does it exist in the first place? What is it for? Now, to discern the purpose of something, the scientific approach is often to trace it back to its origins, to its beginnings. Well, what are the origins of consciousness? Where did consciousness begin? Of course, your beliefs determine how far back we look. If we believe that the natural world is all that there is, then our search for the origins of consciousness will reside within nature, within this world. But what if the origins of consciousness are more ancient even than this? Is the natural world all that there is, or is there more? And if nature alone is not enough to explain human consciousness, perhaps we need to expand the scope of our search beyond nature. The Judeo-Christian faith has a lot to say about this. The very first verses of the Bible say, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." In other words, a conscious, rational being known as God is fundamental to the universe. And before there was anything physical, there was God. And as Jesus said, God is spirit. And if this is true, then we have grounds for making sense of the human mind. And there is hope for solving the hard problem of consciousness. Human beings, this view says, are made by God and are known by Him and have the capacity to know God precisely because they are conscious beings. My story, in short, is that those questions that came into my consciousness as a child led me to the person of Jesus Christ as an adult. I arrived to study biochemistry at Bristol, an agnostic. I assumed, like others that you've heard this evening, that science and God were incompatible. I had the chance to ask a question at an event known as Guerrilla Christian, where I asked, surely you can't be a scientist and a Christian at the same time, and was told that yes, you can. These are offering mutually compatible perspectives on the world. Well, that set me on a journey where I grilled a lot more Christians, I asked a lot more questions, and I got to the stage where it made more sense to believe that God was real than to discount Him and continue without Him. Around halfway through this biochemistry degree, I decided to become a follower of Jesus Christ. And it was wonderful to continue as a scientist, but also to know the God behind it all. And I came to realize that although the natural world was absolutely incredible. It was not all that there is. Not all that there is to life, not all that there is to human beings. I came to realize that we are so much more than our bodies and brains, and that there is an identity that runs so much deeper than my career, my influence, or even publication record. That identity was grounded and became grounded in my early 20s in a friendship with God through Jesus. A friendship that is available to all of us and that we are told will last forever. And if that is true, then there is hope for us all. Thank you for listening.